Welcome back to another conversation with Carl. Today's topic is reinvention. But before we begin, if you enjoy these conversations, subscribe. Today, experts say we can have an average of up to 7 careers. So, how does one go about redefining themselves? For advice on that topic, we'll talk to my next guest. Barbara Stark Neiman is a speech pathologist and an author of 3 novels. Let's welcome Barbara to the conversation.
Well, hello, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Carl.
Thank you. So let me get started. So you were a speech pathologist and then you retired and then you decided to become an author. How did that evolve and how did that process begin?
Well, the process began when I was a child, actually. You and I talked previously about a through line of storytelling in my life. I had a grandfather who was an attorney and a master storyteller, and he encouraged that skill with his grandchildren. And we got a better dessert if we told a good story. And I was also a very avid reader early on, so I loved to read stories. I was encouraged to tell stories. I then became an English teacher, and then there were children in my class who couldn't read and write as well as I thought they could think, or they couldn't speak well. And I became interested in what happens when our skills don't allow us to access stories. So I became a speech and language pathologist to work with kids with learning disabilities and kids with hearing problems, deaf kids. So that was a turn where I was learning how to evaluate and assist children who had problems, either telling or accessing stories. Did that for about 30 years. And I loved it, pretty good at it, if I do say so. But there was always this nagging desire to tell a story in the form of a novel. That was the top item on my bucket list. And so I scheduled my retirement such that I could attend a workshop through the University of Michigan that was my first writer's workshop. And I had the story to tell. It was a family story, and that became my first novel. And it went on from there.
Did you just one day know you wanted to write a novel and just sat down and start writing?
Always have written what I call snippets. I actually did write a couple of short stories in high school that were pretty well received. And the first writing award I ever got was for a short story that was published. I all my life have written little scenes, little snippets, little parts of stories that came to me. And at various points in my life, I did keep journals. However, I never thought that I could or would write a novel. And that sort of later on in my career, I went, I think I could actually do this. For some of your guests or your listeners who are older, the notion that some assembled wisdom, some skill set, some confidence that arrived later in my life made me think, I think I could do this, or at least I want to try. I'm willing to give it a real try. So it's never too late to
But
become
you
a
have to be
writer.
vulnerable, right? You have to get you going when you're starting to do this, you have to be you're giving something about yourself and you're letting people judge you.
That is true. There are editors, there are readers, and that is a very sometimes scary but also exciting part of the process. And a writer has to develop some thick skin and learn how to accept input from others because ultimately that's what you want. You want to know what's going to attract a writer to develop goals. People constantly say to me, I got this story, or I have these letters, or I have this idea, and I don't know whether it makes sense for me to try to write a book. And I always say, what would be your goal to do that? In whose hands do you want that book to? Is it just for yourself? Is it for your family? Is it for a broader readership? Is it for a career opportunity? What is the goal? And that will help you figure out whether it's worth it to write,
What was
whatever.
your goal?
It's interesting. My initial goal so my first book is based on the life of my great aunt who lived in Germany. She's the only member of my family that did not escape Nazi Germany because she wouldn't leave without her mother and her husband. And so she stayed. She was interned in a concentration camp. She survived because she was a massage therapist to the commandant, and she went on to outlive everyone she fought to save. But then she also ended up spending the last 40 years of her 100 years in an absolutely transcendent relationship with a Catholic priest, half her age, in Germany, and never had another bad day. I got to know and love those two people. It was such an alternative and, in many ways, unacceptable version of a Holocaust story, but it inspired me. She inspired me. They inspired me. That concept that unwelcome, horrible things can happen to us, but it's what we do with it that makes a difference. That theme really made a big impression on me. She did. And that's the story I wanted to tell. So my goal originally was to get that story out. My publishing goal was write the book, get it printed, make 50 copies of it, send it to my family and close friends and my writers group, and be done with it.
That's even in
However,
darkness, right?
that's even in darkness, yes.
Okay.
And however, what happened is that as I got into writing it, and particularly the people in my writing group became very enthusiastic about it, started showing it when I was finished with the first draft to editors who said, I think you've really got something here. And I pitched it to agents and so forth. And then I went to my first writers' conference that was after the one that I started writing this book, and there was a contest. You could submit a manuscript, and if you won, you got to have dinner with the keynote speaker, who in this particular instance was Barbara Kingsolver.
Yeah.
And I won that contest. And all of a sudden, it was like, wait a minute, this story has legs beyond my little sphere. So at that point, I decided my goal became to actually publish it and let it fly. And so I did that, and it's done quite well. So it's won a lot of book awards, and I've gotten many, many, many readers telling me how much the book meant to them. Well, that's
Yeah.
that's what we do this for.
I just remember when I was in college, I took a Holocaust class, and the professor said that the Holocaust is 6 million different stories. It's not one story.
Yes,
And that
that's
is,
brilliant. That's a wonderful thing. Not everybody agrees with that. I got a lot of pushback about how can you tell a story that puts a Catholic priest, in a good light after everything that happened. And I said, well, because it's true. 85% of what happens and even in darkness actually happened. The other 15%, not so much.
yeah. So that is one point that you notice that when you're writing, you write a lot of what we know. When you're sitting at your table writing, did you get worried? Are people going to like it? Did you worry about how the words came together, or did you just write?
Don't worry about when I'm writing. I don't worry about it in terms of how people are going to react. That's later. That's a later process. Do worry about, I'm not one of those people who just kind of dumps out a first draft just to get something on paper. I really am constantly editing as I go. I can spend a half an hour on a sentence because I know how I want it to feel, but it isn't working that way yet. So it means I have to work on it a little bit or go to the sentence before it and figure out what is the problem here. So I would say I'm a pretty deliberate writer. It's part of why it takes me so long to finish a first draft, but then the editing process after that is a little less painful, I think, for me than for some other authors, because I've done so much of that as
Since
I go.
since you took the story, which happened to your aunt, your great aunt, when you took the story, did you sit there and you knew what you wanted to write, or were you, because you said 15% is fiction, 85% is real. Were you ever thinking like, oh, I'm going to change stuff along the way? Did you know what you wanted to change? or did you know what you wanted to tell and keep that in there?
It's a great question. I think it's important to state that I knew, loved, exhaustively interviewed both of the people upon who this book is based, as well as my grandparents, my parents. So I had a lot of original material. And then when my great aunt died, the priest sent me all of her personal papers, including 100 letters that her son had written her from where he'd been sent to Palestine back to Germany after the war when he learned that his parents were still alive. And I translated all those letters. I had her orders to report to the factory in Theresienstadt where she was, I had just tons of papers that informed the story. And then I had family stories that I'd been hearing all my life about what happened to her. I interviewed her nieces who were sent off to Belgium and still lived there. So I had a lot of original material, and I didn't include all of it because I did know the direction of the story. The story was going to be her story, and then later in the book, his story and their story together. So that I knew, and that was kind of my guiding light. I knew what moved me about their story. And so if the facts contributed to that, they got included. And if they didn't, I didn't include them. So I felt like I had to hew to the basic story. There were a couple of fictional characters. There were characters that related to real people but were a little bit different. But the essential characters and the essential facts of her life are represented factually. I mean, they're represented really.
A lot of writers will tell you that they don't know where they're going when they start to write. So did you have to, when you were writing and then you're going through the facts and you're putting your story together, did you have to go back to chapter one again and be like, okay, I have to change stuff? Or did you just write through and then wait till the editing process?
That's a great question. In even in Darkness, I had to do less of that revision and reordering, and I didn't have to do a great deal of that in Hard Cider, which is my second novel. Both those stories are based in either aspects of my own life or my great aunt's life. With my new book, with Isabella's Way, I actually had to create a timeline. I'm not one of those people who has a whole whiteboard full of sticky notes that I can pick up and move around. So I do kind of write through a story with a basic ending in mind. And I never believed what I'd read about other authors, that all of a sudden a character would just do something and the author would say, I can't believe they did that. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? You've written this. This is all coming out of your imagination. But I've had that experience now of, wow, where did that come from? I wasn't anticipating it. So there are surprises, and very, very much the case that when I've finished with a first draft, I'm always going back to the very beginning and saying, okay, this is where it ended up. Is this the right beginning? And
Okay.
the first time that an editor told me, your story actually starts on page 42, so let's get rid of those first two chapters, I almost fell off my chair because I had just killed myself over those first two chapters. But very often I think writers will start to write what they need to know to get into the story. Then
Yeah.
the story starts, but that's not necessarily what the reader needs to know. And
Yes.
that's kind of a very interesting dynamic that I was totally unaware of. I don't have a master's in fine arts and writing. I was an English major in college. I've always, I wrote my entire career reports and stuff like that, short pieces that I talked about earlier. But that's apparently a known thing among writers' workshops and stuff. And I've learned that's true. And I've become more aware of it, having now written 3 books.
When you met Barbara Kingsolver, and she's written a lot, and did you show her your work? How did she respond to you? Because it looks like she got you to the next step.
First of all, I was absolutely starstruck. She's one of my favorite authors. and was even way back then. I mean, this was like in 2010. And she was as down to earth and as approachable and as lovely. I mean, she had just gotten through giving a keynote speech, so she wanted to eat her dinner as I did. She was there with her husband and her son, and she was working on the Lacuna, which I don't know if you've ever read that. It's a wonderful one. I love that novel of hers. And so we talked about my story and her story, and we talked about writing. But she didn't give me any specific advice other than she treated me like another writer. And it was such a boost. It was so fulfilling. It just made me feel like I'm another writer. I won this contest. I got to have dinner with Barbara Kingsolver. And I mean, I study her writing because I think she's brilliant. And it was really one of the experiences of my lifetime. That's for sure.
Your three novels all have Jewish characters, which are central to the novel. And with the rise of anti Semitism today, how are people reacting to the novels?
Well, Even in Darkness came out in 2015. I did a lot of Holocaust groups, Holocaust museum presentations, synagogue, library presentations, a lot of Jewish book groups. And I had a couple of Holocaust survivors who said it's a lovely book, but I had to put it down because I really couldn't accept that this woman stayed in Germany and went on to live with this priest and, kind of happily ever after. And I totally understood that. I said, this isn't a book for everyone. And what she didn't do, which other people and other critics did, is say that it's immoral. You're a bad Jewish writer if you write this kind of thing. That was in 2015. I didn't feel any anti-Semitism. I felt that people's own experiences, their views on the Holocaust. I mean, both my parents were German. They came here as teenagers. There was no Germany hating in our household. They both traveled back there. They did business. My grandfather was an attorney. He got readmitted to the bar in Germany and did restitution law for Jews and others who lost property, lost health, and so forth, got, pensions and restitution money. And he traveled to Germany with my grandmother at least 3 or 4 times a year to try cases. I didn't grow up with the anti-German feeling that a lot of other people whose parents were refugees did. So that's where it kind of starts. So I felt like there was some respectful, this is just not for me, or I don't agree with this, but I did not feel that it was targeted, nor did I feel that there was anything anti-Semitic about the response to that book. Hard Cider, the main character is Jewish, but it's not a Jewish book. Not, there's no specifically Jewish content in it. But my current book is very definitely Jewish historical fiction. There is Jewish content. It's about a 14-year-old who has to escape Portugal in order to escape the Inquisition. And she has to make her way through Spain and France and into Germany, where her father's trying to reestablish a life, because it's 100 years after the expulsion from Spain. And now there's kind of a second expulsion going on from Portugal. And so this is very much a book about the Inquisition. It's about she's being pursued by a Catholic priest who's bound and determined to find and punish conversos, people who were converted to Catholicism but may or may not have remained Jewish. In this girl's case, she doesn't even know that she's a converso until almost halfway through the book. So this is a book with Jewish content. It's a book with refugee content. As recently as this afternoon, when talking to a synagogue about working with a Jewish family service that does all the refugee immigrant intake for my county with the synagogue, there was a question about whether this should be broadly published to the public, or whether this program should be, because it's a program with a refugee piece and my book piece, whether that should be broadly published in the community or whether it should just be broadly announced in the Jewish community for security reasons. So, I mean, that literally happened this afternoon.
Yeah.
And I have had bookstores have to take in a deep breath and say, do I want to bring this content? Because when I pitch it, I could just say this is about an embroiderist. She has to escape. She embroiders secret symbols in order to designate safe houses or danger, kind of like an Underground Railroad idea, and leave it at that. And not use the word refugee, not use the word Jewish, not use those trigger words. So it has been a thing. In the publicity campaign leading up to the publication, places that were happy to review and, talk about my book sort of hesitated. It's gotten great reviews, and a lot of places, including you, are willing to talk about it, but it's been a thing, and it's really a different environment, and it's challenging, and
Does that scare you?
it doesn't scare me, but it's very disappointing. What I've struggled with is, what am I doing running around talking about my little book when the world is falling apart? Like, should I be using my time and effort, to address things that are a lot more serious than whether to advertise a book publicly or more privately? But I really thought about that. And I think this book has some messages that we need to hear about othering people, about persecuting people because of their religion, about who decides what you really believe. If you say you're Catholic, are you Catholic? If you say you're not Jewish, are you Jewish anyway? I mean, these are, and when I started writing this book, I had no idea that our country would be in the situation that we are in with regard to immigrants and refugees. So that there's a whole new valence that comes with having a book with this content than there was when I started writing it. And my parents were both refugees. And I worked with Jewish Family Services for 15 years, establishing them as the primary agency for immigrants and refugees in my county. So I did the strategic planning that helped them become that. So I'm invested in it.
How does your family react to you writing? Are they like, oh, she's happy she's writing, or are they like, because how do you spend your day writing? Do you start at like 9 a.m. to 6 o'clock, or do you write like from 9 to 3 and then?
My goodness. So first of all, I am so thrilled that my family, like my mother's still alive. My 100-year-old mother is still alive and with us. And my dad, even before he died, was so proud. And my siblings are all supportive. My husband, I mean, he was a big time, pretty accomplished doctor. And he was very used to, my going to the dinners, at his hospital, and my being Dr. Neiman's wife, right? And now everywhere we go, he's Barbara Stark Neiman's husband, because people now are reading my books and talking to me about that. And he loves it, but it was an adjustment. My favorite story about my kids is, and they all are all pleased and proud. They're all very busy with their own lives. But my favorite story about my kids is that my oldest son loves to build furniture, and he was buying a piece of slate to make into a table. And he went to somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin near where he lives, and he got some ad off of Craigslist and went to the middle of nowhere, saw the piece of slate, said, oh, this is perfect. He pulls out his checkbook. He writes a check to the woman. He hands her the check, and our last name is spelled Nemon. It's an unusual spelling of Neiman. She looks at the check and she goes, are you related to the author? And my son goes, what author? It's like my mom. It's not my but I tell that story in my book events because just in case my head gets a little bit too big around, the success of my books, my kids are here to keep me
Oh,
honest.
you're not an author. What are you working on next? Or you are on tour right now?
I'm on tour right now, and I've got 8 grandkids and a 100-year-old mother, so I've got a life beyond my book, but I've been very busy traveling and doing podcasts and book groups. And I should say to your audience, if anybody has a book group that they'd like me to Zoom in. I always love to do that. And I have a couple of short projects that I've put off that I really want to do. One is kind of a cookbook with related stories from the person who assembled this cookbook, from her past, and how each of those items came into that cookbook. And I just loved her story. So I'm thinking about putting that together. I've been asked already for both Hard Cider and Isabella's Way to do a sequel. Who knows if that's in me? Right now, I'm just very grateful to be focusing on the launch of Isabella's Way, and I'm having a great time talking to people in libraries and on podcasts. But I would say that by January, I'll be back to the desk. And the answer to your earlier question is no, I do not have a disciplined writing schedule. My favorite place to write is at our home in northern Michigan, looking out at Lake Michigan, where I can sit down at 8 o'clock in the morning and the next thing I know, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I need chunks of time. I'm not one of those people who can sit down and write for 20 minutes and then go make dinner. That's not my technique.
And if someone is looking at a new career or thinking about making a change in their lives, what would you suggest they do?
Stop saying no to yourself first. Stop beginning with all the reasons why you can't do it, and be clear about what it is that really floats your boat, even if it seems like something very, very distant and impossible to imagine yourself actually doing. What is something, first of all, when you retire, literally give yourself a year to sort your life out, clean your closets out, organize your time, start working out, do some cooking that you didn't do, whatever it is that you do, give yourself time before you start putting pressure on, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? And then, at least for me, I had no idea if I could write a book or not. But what I did is break it down. The next thing I did, once I knew that is really what my goal was, is to break it down, like, what would be the first step? Like, what would
It's
be
like
the
running a
first?
marathon, because they say
Exactly.
you run it a mile at a time. You don't run 26 miles. You run 1 mile, run the next mile, you do the
Right.
next mile.
And it's like training for a marathon. You can't
Yeah.
run a marathon. You've got to train for it first. And so if you've never run before, your first job is to run around the block once
Yeah.
and not be down on yourself if you had to walk halfway around. But
Yeah.
then the next day, run around the block again and see how much farther you got. So it's the breaking things down. And then a very, very big thing is find your posse. Find other people who might be influential, might be supportive, might be good resources, and invite those people into your sphere in whatever way, just even starting with an email. Or if writing is your thing, go to your library and see if there's a writing group. Sit in for a while, see if it makes sense to you. Don't force yourself into things that don't make sense. You'll know pretty quickly if what you're choosing is working, and don't be disappointed if the first thing you try doesn't work well, because you've got another thing to try. So those are my biggest things, and give yourself permission to say yes rather than saying no.
Well, no, that's exactly right. We want to be able to give ourselves permission to do stuff, to experience stuff, and that if you have the opportunity to, I think we have to keep redefining ourselves. I don't think
Yes.
we have to be one person, one idea. This is what you started at. This is how you have to end. I think life is just evolving continuously.
Well, that is what keeps us alive, right?
Yes.
I mean, from the cellular level on up. That is exactly right. I mean, you're a perfect example of that. I mean, this podcast is
Yes.
the
Correct.
poster child for that.
Yes.
So I
And it's continuing what I did before in a
exactly.
different form. So I just have continued it, and now I've created something new. So Barbara Stark, I'm gonna mess up your name again. Barbara Stark Neiman, thank you
Just call
so
me
much for
Barbara Ann. That's what my
Barbara Ann.
friends call me.
Barbara Ann, Barbara Stark Neiman, thank you so much for joining me. She has 3 novels out: Hard Cider, Even in Darkness, Isabella's Way. You can get that wherever you get your books. You can also reach out to her on her website, Barbara Stark Neiman. Is that what's your website?
It's www.barbarastarkneiman.com. And Neiman is spelled Nemon. It's not the normal way.
You can
I'm
get
also on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. Barbara B. Stark Neiman at Gmail is my email. So I'd love to hear from people.
and if you want, she'll come zoom into your book club.
I will.
Yes. So thank you also for joining me today. The next time I will see you then. Thanks.